I'll kick it off. Welcome, everybody.
Very good.
It's good to see your faces. So I'm going to call the meeting to order. And I'd love to introduce our newest advisory board member, Mary Ukta, who's joined in the slot of the Dean of a Graduate Economics program. Mary's the professor of International Macroeconomics and Finance at the CUNY Graduate Center and is currently the center's interim associate dean. And I guess, can we circulate her bio for the longer full bio? But I would just say, welcome, Mary. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. And pleasure to be here with all of you.
Great. And then I'm just going to shout out who I saw join us today, and you can just wave. So I saw Wayne Ho joined us this morning, Tony Shorus, Mark Page, and Fenwick Huss. And I think we're waiting on Kareem Hudson and Mark Canizaro. So welcome, everyone. And Lisa, are you going to introduce the team?
Sure. I can. I'm Lisa Neary, IBO's new-ish chief of staff. Ronnie Lowenstein, you all know. Maserati Fernandez is our IT guy. His phone number is in the chat if you have technology issues. Beth Brown is IBO's new communications director. Sarita Subramanian heads up the education team. Jonathan Rosenberg, our budget director. Sarah Stefanski, housing and infrastructure. George Sweeting, deputy director. Nick Martin on the education team. Who am I missing? Oh, Emily.
Emily.
It's our newest member of the housing and infrastructure team. Did I cover everybody? Oh, and there's Mark Canizaro has arrived from his vehicle.
Yes. Good morning, everyone.
Drive safe.
I will. Thank you.
Okay, so the first thing up on the agenda is to approve the minutes of the March 23rd, 2021 meeting. So I need a motion to approve.
Moved. Or second.
Okay, Tony's first and Wayne is second. Awesome. And then I'm going to kick it over to Ronnie for the director's report.
Okay, some of this will be redundant, but I wanted to start by welcoming our newest employee, Emily, who you just saw wave a moment ago. She's going to be our new transportation analyst. She comes to us from the Department of City Planning, where she worked in the capital planning division. So it's a really nice fit, and it's really great to have someone come in already having city experience. So that's perfect. As some of you know, I think Doug Turetsky, our longtime chief of staff and communications director, recently retired. And as sorry as I was to see Doug leave, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to promote from within two really talented people who've worked at IBO for a long time. Lisa, as she already mentioned, is our new chief of staff. And Beth is going to be our new communications director, although we've expanded that position somewhat to include a bunch of editing responsibilities that I'm very, very happy to get rid of. And previously, Lisa, of course, had been our general counsel. Beth had been assistant director for our housing environment and housing infrastructure environment team. And most recently did the evaluation of the industrial development economic incentives that was presented at the last meeting and will actually be published on this Friday. Finally, we've been waiting for council to sign off on this, because if you remember, it was the product of an agreement, a local law and an agreement between IBO and the council. And it took this long for the council to say yes, and we'll be getting it out Friday. We had two other retirements of very long-term IBO employees. Paul Lopato, who headed the social and community services team, has retired, as has David Belkin, a senior economist who was responsible for much of the best of our local coverage over many years. We're currently seeking replacements for both of those positions, along with a new general counsel to replace Lisa. If you know of anyone who might be interested, please direct them to the website in the job opportunities section of the website. And I think we particularly appreciate candidates, excuse me, who bring greater diversity to the staff. We've very gradually begun to return to the physical offices at 110 William. You can see some people are in the office. The people with masks, those of us without masks, are still at home. And we're gradually moving towards a hybrid model where we'll be generally spending 3 days in the office and 2 days remote, where we're able to. I think the last 18 months has been almost surprisingly productive at IBO. We pivoted to do more shorter term work. Lots of people stepped up. Output increased. All the mandated reports came out on time, and some of them in new and interesting formats. And on the basis of that experience, I think staff made a persuasive argument, saying, let's build on that and give people some flexibility that they didn't have before. We're not governed by the mayoral regulations on 5 days a week in person. And we're hoping that moving towards the hybrid model will mean that we'll have a comparative advantage over some other city agencies that will perhaps make us a more attractive place to work and make it easier to recruit. So that's the plan, at least. And we're in the process of making it work. I just want to say a couple of things about longer term work. We're putting some additional resources into a couple of critical long-term issues. I think we're very concerned about the pace of the economic recovery and even the extent to which the New York City economy will change in the aftermath of the pandemic. Most obviously, the pandemic has accelerated the trend towards remote work, even at IBO, leaving large swaths of Midtown and downtown empty, and putting downward pressure on office rents and property taxes. And even if international tourism recovers sooner or later, it's hard to believe that business travel is going to look the same as it did before. What this means to us is we've got to start putting more resources into the local economic forecast to try to get a better handle on what might be coming down the pipe. The other place where we're adding resources, and Emily is the embodiment of that, is on the MTA, even though it's not a city agency. Given the city's complete reliance on the MTA and the MTA's reliance heavily on the fare box, the question is what's going to happen if ridership doesn't increase and federal government aid starts to wane. So, both of those are areas we're putting in more. And then in terms of near term, we've updated our guides to the budget that because 2/3 of the city council and 4/5 of the borough presidents are all going to be new. And I think there's going to be a lot of demand for that. And near term, we've got a paper coming out on the kindergarten choice program and what it's done. And another one on the AC Administration for Children's Services preventive program, where they provide services to keep kids out of foster care. So those are the longer term priorities we're looking at, and those are the short term papers, along with the evaluation of the industrial development tax incentives that you'll be seeing short term. So with that, let me hand it back to Jen.
Great. So I just want to recognize that Karim Hudson has joined us also.
And also Elizabeth Guzman, who's the Public Advocates General Counsel. And there's somebody else here who, BM Cray, I don't know who that is, but it'd be helpful if you could let us know. Hi. And then also I neglected to introduce Tara Swanson, who's our communications assistant.
Great.
Sorry about
that. So I think before we get started with the staff presentations, we'd encourage advisory board members and anyone representing an elected official's office to unmute and interrupt the presenter with questions. If that becomes unworkable, we'll shift gears, but you're welcome to interrupt and ask questions as the presentation rolls along. So the first presentation is on New York City's plan for the $7.3 billion federal COVID-related aid for schools. And Sarita is going to give that presentation.
Okay, I was just going to say very much the same thing. This is a product of our education team. Sarita Subramanian heads the team. Will do the presentation, but she's accompanied by Nick Martin, who's the lead author of the study and who's going to be with us to field questions should they arise. Okay, take it away, Sarita.
Thanks, Ronnie. I'm going to share my screen. So yes, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about a brief that we recently published that takes a deep dive into the $7.3 billion in federal COVID-related aid for schools. And just a quick summary of what the brief does. So based on the adopted budget for the current fiscal year, 2022, we identified what Department of Education programs will the COVID-related aid be used for. We do note that almost half of the total federal relief funding is planned for this current year, 2022. We then go into defining what we call two broad categories of programs. The first are short-term programs, and these are programs that are meant to address learning loss due to COVID-related disruptions to education over the last year, restore temporary cuts from last year when the economic and the fiscal conditions were more dire before the aid came in, and also to cover school reopening costs. The second category of programs we designate as long-term programs, and these are programs that are recurring and they're expected to continue beyond the expiration of the federal relief funds. And many of these include expansions of existing programs. In terms of the expansions, except for the 3K expansion, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, all the other expansions are only half funded in 2025, which is the last year of the financial plan from the adopted budget. After 2025, the recurring programs are expected to cost about $790 million annually. And I will get into more details of the breakdown of that $790 million as well. So in total, I did want to mention, I'll try to leave some time at the end of each slide for questions. So we looked at the breakdown in the total $7.3 billion in federal COVID-related aid. The largest pot of that is $7 billion, which is in federal education aid from the U.S. Department of Education, and that flowed through the New York State Education Department. $2.2 billion of that was from the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or CRRSA, and that was passed in December of 2020. And a larger amount, $4.8 billion, is from the larger American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, that was passed in March of this year. An additional $336 million has been allocated to the DOE from the ARPA State and Local Recovery Fund. And this is direct local aid to New York City. So this was intended to replace lost revenue for the city, and the city was able to allocate the roughly $6 billion of that to any needs it needs to. So $336 million of that was allocated to the Department of Education. I do want to also mention that of the $4.8 billion in ARPA funds through the education aid, at least 20% of that must be spent to address learning loss due to disruptions in education from the pandemic through the implementation of evidence-based interventions, such as after-school or summer programming. So we looked at the breakdown of this federal COVID-related aid in two different ways. So first we looked by year, and then we separately looked at by program, the two broad categories that I mentioned, the short-term programs and the long-term programs. So focusing on the chart on the left, you can see that we're showing the three different pots of funds that I talked about. The dark blue bars are CRSA funds that last between 2021 and 2024. The light blue are the ARPA education aid funds, and that spans 2022 through 2025. And finally, the ARPA local aid portion is the light gray, and that you could see most prominently in 22 and 25, although there are small amounts also in 23 and 24. So you could see that, as I mentioned, almost half of the aid is budgeted for this current year, 22, and that tails off over the next 3 years to less than $1 billion by 2025. We also looked by short-term versus long-term programs, and you could see that almost half of the funds are allocated to long-term programs, and these are recurring programs that are expected to continue past the expiration of the federal aid. It's important to note, though, when you look at 2022, over 80% of the funds expected for 22 are for short-term programs. So those programs that are dedicated to address learning loss, school reopening, more immediate needs.
I should know this, but how will we know if they're actually spending what they plan to spend on what they plan to spend it on? Because, there's always, school enrollment is fluctuating as the Delta variant persists. Mm-hmm. Maybe the take up of the Summer Rising program, they got close, but maybe they didn't hit their mark. So how is there a way to monitor what's left unspent?
Yeah, so that's something that we are definitely actively doing and looking at, this brief really talks about the plan, but there is a lot of follow-up work to look at what they actually do spend it on. And some of what we've been focusing on is reconciling the plan with what we see actually happening. So we do mention in the brief that, one area we're looking at are school allocation memoranda. So these are where they where's the central, like Tweed, distributes funds to schools. So we do note that as of the time of publication, over $1 billion was distributed through the school allocation memoranda to schools for this current school year. So we are tracking that and looking at the various, some of the, and like you mentioned, we have looked at the SAM for Summer Rising. So I think that actually, initially the plan was almost like 50 million of the federal aid, but that increased and was adjusted by the end of the summer to over 90 million, if I'm correct. Yeah. So I should also mention that in the city's financial management system, they are using dedicated lines that they've created specifically for the ARPA and CRSA funds. So we are able to track also in the financial management system the use of those funds. Now, some of those categorizations could be really large, and so that's where we have really tried to ask both DOE and OMB more questions about what programmatically are these funds to be used for.
Do you have any ability to actually go into a school and ask?
I don't think there's anything preventing us from doing that per se, but it hasn't been something we've done in the past.
No, we've not done that. We have gone into schools for some of our more qualitative work, most notably when we were looking at services provided to kids who live in homeless shelters. And we did a fair amount of interviewing, including a lot of background interviews within the schools themselves. But do you have a suggestion, Mark? I mean, what's your...
I don't really know. I mean, I think there's a certain degree of skepticism that some of us have about dollars advertised and product delivered as to, I mean, how do they relate to each other? And in an odd way, if it were possible to just identify who is in charge of various of these aid-supported programs in, 5 or 6 schools even, and just see if you could make an appointment and listen to what they had to say for a couple of hours.
The other thing to make it a little more challenging, and you guys should help me on this, Sarita, are we categorizing these dollars as categorical dollars?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But even though they're categorical, they're actually reasonably flexible in how they can be used, right?
Yes.
Which means they're essentially fungible with some care with a lot of city-funded programs. Which means, to Mark's point, it's kind of all going into the big machine and can be swished around accordingly. It also gets back to the question that we raised at the beginning about, how do you know it's going to be spent, et cetera, et cetera. If it is swishable aroundable, then it's really all just going to show up in the bottom line of DOE spending and underspending. And they will probably move it to places directly or indirectly to places where they need the money. So I think it's going to be a little tricky because even though it is categorical, sort of, it's a big category, so to speak. It's pretty fungible.
Yeah, and I would say, it is intended to fill in where revenues were lost, which is a really broad definition.
Right. Is this Mark?
I'm right with Tony that it sounds like a mountain of mush, and actually having some, if we were able to provide a sort of third party check, even if it's just pinpoint a few interviews with people as to what they have to say.
I mean, the best way to know some of the dollars, once they hand it out, once it's in a school allocation memo, it pretty much goes to a school.
Mm-hmm.
Once it shows up in a fair student funding allocation formula, it pretty much goes to the school. And the schools pretty much spend their money. They rarely end up with not spending their money. Mm-hmm. It's really the money that's not allocated directly out to the schools and used for whatever other purpose that you'd have to track centrally but for the most part, Mark, because it's not really targeted in the school. I mean, they're using it for specific programs, but schools do move their money around, and a good principal knows to do that. That makes you a smart principal, not a stupid principal. If you got money for this over here, but not enough for that over there, you find a way to move it around.
I'm totally sympathetic. I mean, it's just, I'd love to know what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is Mark Cannizzaro still on? Is this something that
yeah, I'm here. I'm here and I'm listening. Very interesting. Very interested. Yeah, I mean, what they're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, a big pot of money this year, especially for Summer Rising, was spent on community-based organizations, which was sort of hastily rolled out, and they weren't prepared to service as many kids as they had to service. So there was a big increase in spending because they had to increase those contracts and even increase salaries and things in order to attract people. But yes, a lot of this money that is sent to schools is moved around, and a lot of the money that is is line items for schools isn't necessarily for schools. They put a lot of administrative costs in there too. So, you know, it's very difficult, if not impossible. You'd have to go to pretty much a really broad sample of schools to find out where everything went in each place. But it would be a huge job to try to figure that out.
I don't think you need to do a huge sample to find out whether you think that the money is actually being spent productively. You know, when you look at this prospect for the future, I mean, it appears that the current situation is that there's a lot of money sloshing around. So whether you're spending it efficiently is, I mean, it's hard to go from, you know, standing still to running fast in 10 minutes. But as you go out through the several years of this plan and you look at the reduction in free money that is inevitably going to, well, I don't know, I would expect is going to happen. The question of whether you're really on track to provide programs reasonably efficiently, I think becomes pretty intense as you go along. And, you know, even if your hearsay is a sample of 6 schools in terms of what's going on, or, you know, when you increase your contract with not-for-profits to get service done, I mean, the possibilities of just sort of money paying people who aren't doing a hell of a lot, I think looms as a question, whether it's a problem. I don't know, and it would be interesting to have some light.
I'll just note, and then maybe.
Yeah, I mean, look, I
Can I make a quick comment?
Go ahead.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Guzman from the Public Advocate's Office. I just want to suggest that this is something we can take up with Jamani and with Brad Lander once he comes in in January. I think it's a project he would be interested in pursuing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And right now, Jamani has visited a number of schools, so we do have access to the schools. And what we've seen is it's still in a bit of a disarray, given the vaccination issue with the teachers, but that's largely resolved, but also the schools that have had to close, or the classrooms where folks are sent home. So I think it'll just take a while for this to sort itself out.
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Agreed on that.
Ask a question?
Yeah.
Can the new mayor in January change all these allocations, or is he stuck with what's budgeted now?
Anything can change.
So I'm just actually, I mean, to everybody's point, I mean, that even makes it more, I love the word swishable or swishable.
You'd have to go through the council, right? If it were above a certain amount.
Not necessarily. I mean, Tony's point about categorical money, it does not necessarily have to go through the council.
I mean, how they floated through the budget. But.
I know the governor has appointed, in fact, the former GC of Stringer's former GC to guide this process and monitor the federal dollars that came into New York State and then to the municipalities.
So maybe the point is that we need more transparency, right? Like we do the report and talk about the need for transparency about what's happening.
Sorry, Wayne. And maybe with that, I should just briefly turn to Jonathan, who can give us like 1 or 2 sentences on the tracking work that he's doing. Jonathan?
Yeah. Okay, 1 or 2 sentences. Yeah, we are currently. No, we're currently in the process of trying to, as Serena had mentioned, we do have some insight into actual expenditures. Yes, especially with education, a lot of this is really large buckets of money that is a little more difficult to get granularity on, but we're trying to put something forward-facing kind of dashboard together that would present some of this information at an agency level, at a programmatic level, not only for education, but also through all the ARPA funds that go through all other agencies as well. So hopefully we can get something out within a reasonable amount of time, and actually working with OMB, where they're actually interested in working with us to assist us in this, because I guess they want transparency as well, supposedly.
That'd be great.
I mean, if I may, I think there's two things, right? One is, what was the federal intent of the money? And as we all, as the stimulus went on, or the later packages, there are obviously a lot of pushback at the federal level. So one was saying terms like learning loss, I would assume, is just something that was more palatable at the federal level in order to get money out the door, just to fill budget gaps at the local level for LEAs and SEAs. And then I think on the other side is an argument can be made that every student had learning loss and every teacher struggled and every school struggled. I think there's a larger conversation here about DOE and budget transparency and how they use their resources. But I think to me, that's a little separate than us trying to track down where $7 billion went during a pandemic, when we had tax revenue issues at the local level and the state level, balanced out with there were significant learning losses, as we know, especially for marginalized communities.
And by the way, Wayne, a chunk of this money was specifically dedicated to offsetting revenue loss, which is essentially general aid from the federal government.
Exactly.
The fact that they had to say, I forgot what you said, the number, I think it's 20% or whatever, had to go specifically to learning loss, leaves you with the implication that the other 80% is not specifically dedicated in the federal mind to learning loss per se. Doesn't mean you can't use it that way. So this was mostly manna from heaven at a very bad time. And it was our responsibility to use it wisely. I'm not sure it'll be a federal problem. So I think the bigger federal problem would actually be if we failed to spend the money. And that I don't think will happen because of our ability to swish it around.
Right. Yes. But I mean, I do think, Anthony, the learning loss issue is a good point. And maybe that's if we do visits, maybe that's where we go and say, in these underserved communities, did the money get there? Right. And how was it used?
And what responsibility does the city have to report back to the feds related to that 20% learning loss? Do they have to document that in some way?
Sarita?
They do have a specific code dedicated to learning loss in the financial management system in FMS. And technically, the state education department is supposed to be overseeing the use of these funds. So I don't know. And the city's plan is supposed to be publicly posted, which we actually have asked where that is, if it has already been posted. We haven't seen it. But they also were expected to, meet with community members, parents, advocates to come up with a plan for these funds, which they did hold meetings to do so. So, but to the extent to which those plans have become publicly available, I haven't necessarily seen it. I know that New York State's plan was sent to the federal government and was approved. But that was pretty, it was not very detailed in what the specific use of the funds were.
Okay.
All right.
Does that put us back on track, Sarita? Are you?
I think so.
Okay. No, but thank you, everybody. There's some good ideas that we can think about and do some digging on. So all good. But Sarita, take it back.
Great. So just talking a little bit more about the short-term uses of funds, $4.1 billion. The terminology I'm going to use here are based on the programs that the DOE and the city announced at the executive budget when these funds were recognized in the budget. So 1.2 billion is for operational support, with a vast majority of that to be spent this current year. And that is to support custodial costs, including extra cleaning supplies, accessibility and infrastructure work, also for school-based retention, staff recruitment and retention programs, and school reopening costs. The next three programs that I have listed here, 850 million for academic recovery, 532 million for instructional support, and 280 million for special education services. And these special education services are intended to catch students up who did not receive those services appropriately during the pandemic. And this is dedicated funds to provide those sort of related services like occupational therapy, physical therapy, et cetera. Portions of these three programs are going to fund a new academic recovery plan for this school year, for 2021-2022, that the mayor announced after the adopted budget. And so that's part of the reconciliation that we are working towards understanding, is how much from each of these programs is going toward that 635 million academic recovery program. But that plan consists of special education supports, additional money to develop the universal mosaic curriculum by the fall of 2023. This is a new citywide curriculum in English and math that aims to reflect the city's cultural diversity. Additional funds for purchasing digital devices and expanding computer science access. There's money for an early literacy program in grades kindergarten through 2, and also 10 million for college and career preparation. So these programs partly fund that one program for 22. And then finally, the other use of short-term funds were to reverse budget cuts from last school year and restore initiatives. So one of the largest budget cuts that was restored was the mid-year adjustment for schools. So schools who lost enrollment from the beginning of the year to the audited register date stood to lose, pretty significant amount of money from their budget, and the federal COVID funds were used to make those schools whole, so that they wouldn't have to incur those large decreases in their budget. In terms of restoring initiatives, the largest one here was 3K. So 3K last year was in 12 districts. It was planned to expand to 4 additional districts this fall. Back, when the fiscal outlook was more dire, that plan was put off. But with the infusion of the federal funds, the city not only continued with the plan to expand to 4 districts, but also expanded citywide with limited seats this fall. And that gets me into the long-term uses of funds, of which the 3K expansion does take up the lion's share, almost $2 billion. So as I mentioned, they did expand citywide with limited seats this year. The plan is for universal access by the fall of 2023. And this chart on the right shows both actual 3K enrollment, those are the dark blue bars, and then the projected enrollment is the light blue bars. So the DOE projects that this expansion would more than double 3K enrollment from 15,500 last school year to almost 35,000 in this school year. And then over the next 2 years, while they expand to universal access, they would add an additional 18,000 seats over the following 2 years. I do want to note that this 3K expansion relies heavily on the New York City Early Education Centers. These are community-based organizations largely that operate both pre-K and 3K. And 73% of the enrollment that's projected for this year is expected to be in these centers. And to give you some perspective, about 54% of pre-K 4-year-olds are in these centers. So this is a much larger share than even pre-K is.
Sarita, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is there a way, some kind of future analysis could look at whether, how they're, I don't know if the appropriate word is commingling, but they're using both education aid and childcare block grant dollars? Pre-K and 3K, and just to understand that over time?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we have been keeping an eye on, and we actually have just submitted questions to the financial status report, our monitors meeting on the child care block grant, but we will definitely keep an eye on that.
And then the other idea I have around mental health is the social workers are paid much better in schools. We've seen like a mass exodus from community mental health clinics.
Yes.
Which in the face of like really skyrocketing mental health needs and insufficient supply of capacity already is really challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it also is really reminiscent of even 3K and pre-K expansion. Yeah, yeah, we did also see articles on that.
And then Sarita, on a related note, I assume that these budget projections are assuming current investments for 3K, including personnel costs. So is there a way we can project out that if we actually had salary parity for community-based early childhood educators and directors, which is something Mark's obviously interested in and many of us as providers are interested in, and if it became parity with UFT agreements, what would that cost look like?
That's a good question. I can take a look at that. I know they did do some, they did address some parity issues with pre-K 4-year-olds. I don't think, I have to check to see if that extends to 3K.
Yeah. Sarita, the as far as personnel costs, you're still going to find approximately you would an almost 100% increase in personnel costs for teachers and supervisors if they had any type of real parity. So I don't know what they have as personnel costs there and how much of it is allocated to teachers and supervisors and how much it would just be administrative costs. But that's one rough estimate way to look at it. But the second question I had is, you mentioned the percentage of children that are educated through the community-based organizations. Do you have a breakdown of all of the community-based organizations that are serving these needs?
Yeah, by program.
Yes, but just I'm talking about the actual agencies, though.
Oh, I mean, we do have data by program on enrollment. We don't have a comprehensive data set of the, how like each program's contract and that sort of information.
Right.
Well, I think you also need to look into some of these 3K expansions are not centers, they're licensed family childcare providers. So it gets a little more complicated.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a basic question of whether the organizations that are ostensibly providing this service actually have the staff and qualifications to do it?
So well, yes, they're all licensed, regulated early childcare providers. But I think, and Wayne jump in, I think as they've expanded 3K, they've found it to be more affordable from a city perspective in the family childcare space than center-based face space. And so there is a lot of expansion, both in CBO centers and licensed family childcare. You know, the types of supports that a licensed family childcare provider or network would need are distinctly different than a center.
Uh-huh.
Yes, we will keep an eye on all that for sure.
At least the greatest extent we're able to, because I mean, getting that level of granularity has been very tough in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. You see, when you just focus on the plan and you just focus on the upper level of what people announce they're doing, I mean, I think that we should try to at least be granular in an occasional snapshot. I think it would be illuminating, frankly.
Yeah, I would say this is our first step, right? You know, we kind of see this as our framework for what the plan is. And like I mentioned, our work since figuring all this out is really to reconcile that with what we see actually being spent. So we're looking at you know, the SLT view, like what schools are spending the money on. We're also looking at the central budget and seeing what we see there. So we do plan on doing more work on that. This is just sort of, you know, laying the groundwork for what is the plan. And then, you know, definitely, I think there's a lot of work to be done through 2025 to figure out what they're using the funds for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm gonna jump ahead. I'm gonna skip mental health. So I mentioned the 3K expansion, and I did want to just note that there are several other expansions that are expected to incur recurring costs even once the federal money runs out. The largest three I have listed here are the pre-K special ed, and this is a program that last year was completely off budget, meaning these are contracts with private schools that the department pays for students with special needs to attend. So in 2021, the cost for that was over $860 million. 3K I just mentioned, for 12 districts last year it was $240 million, and for community schools almost $230 million last year. And as you could see in this far right column, community schools had the largest share that was already federally funded. The other two were largely at 0 and 1% federal funding. With the expansions, now with pre-K special ed, they are planning to add 1,300 additional seats for students with disabilities in 3K and pre-K programs. But the largest infusion of federal money is for 3K, bringing that up to almost $1 billion by the time it's expanded to universal access. And community schools is also planned to increase 100 community schools, bringing the total to 416 schools, just more than a quarter of the number of schools last year. And then you could see in this column that the federal share for all of these programs increased, largely more so for 3K especially. I do think it's important to note that with all of these expansion programs, as I mentioned in the beginning, only 3K is fully funded in 2025. The rest are only half funded. The city did add city funds to make 3K whole in 2025, but that doesn't also change the fact that there is a larger hole that looms in 2026 and beyond. And the price tag for that is almost $790 million. About half of that, as you could see, is for 3K. Pre-K preschool special ed also comprises 95 million, and 94 million of restorations of programs. This includes some of the equity and excellence academic programs that were restored, expanded arts instruction, and a couple of other initiatives. And I didn't really go into the detail, but the mental health for all also, combined, these four pieces are more than 3/4 of the whole left after the expiration of federal funds. We did ask OMB what the plan was for these programs past then, and they said that they are optimistic that as the city recovers from the pandemic, that revenues will increase enough to fund these programs. However, this optimism is not reflected in the revenue outlook in the financial plan, so that does raise questions about the sustainability of these programs after the federal aid expires.
I think that's also known as the next mayor's problem solution.
Yes, that is correct.
That has been used many times in the past, so some of us are familiar with that.
Yes.
With each successive mayor, presumably, every time we change, right?
Yeah. Right. So that's driving the car to the cliff and just hoping a bridge appears by the time you get there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one thing to think about, Sarita, a little bit on this is, sure. I mean, yes, there is the hoped for and yet to be determined tax revenue increase, which we can all say a prayer for. The other thing to think about is the state aid numbers do pretty regularly increase each year. Now, obviously, they have to cover costs in baseline programs as well. But we might want to think about if there was a reasonable level of state aid increase, sort of the average of the pre-COVID 4-year rate or something like that, what that would generate in incremental state aid, how much of that would have to be used to support baseline programs, which also have their own inflation in them, and whether there's any leftover that could potentially go. Because, the cliff doesn't appear for 3 years. You're going to have 3 years of state aid increases during that period that you won't need for these programs.
Yeah, I will note that, I didn't mention this in this presentation, but they did use federal funding to make fair student funding, the city's fair student funding formula whole to schools this year. So some of the federal money sort of filled in for the gap, and the state increases are planned more for by next year, so they use some of the federal money to plug that hole. But they do plan to use the increase in state aid to fully fund fair student funding. So some of that aid already has a planned use.
Right, but fair, and once the state baseline is increased to fully fund fair student, then it's done. We've been trying to get to that for many years now. Schools will use the formula. Once that's done, it's done. So incremental state aid increases over and above that aren't needed for that. So then the question is, other than for baseline inflation, which may consume it all, might there be some increment to build up against this $800 million cliff?
Sarita, I mean, I don't know that anyone has a magic bullet here, but the budget reconciliation at the federal level, if it's not decimated, could help here too, right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation and interesting discussion. Can we move ahead to the second presentation?
Super.
That PowerPoint will be on the website? Will the PowerPoint be on the website?
If it isn't, we'll give it to you.
Yeah, I can send it to you.
Awesome. Send it to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Moreover, there's the paper came out the other day. So there's a lot more information, detail in the paper. And of course, we're around to talk to if you have other questions.
Thank you.
Ronnie, do you want to introduce Sarah?
I'd be delighted to introduce Sarah. Okay. Sarah's the head of our Housing, Environment, and Infrastructure team. She's going to be discussing a paper that we've entitled, Can the City's Organics Collection Program Be Both Fiscally and Environmentally Sustainable? Sarah's doing the presentation, but the primary author of this paper is Dan Huber, who is currently out on parental leave. So Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Ronnie. We're going to share some slides as well. As Ronnie mentioned, I'm here and going to be discussing the citywide organics program this morning. This was a paper that we put out earlier this week. And first of all, just to clue everyone in case you're unfamiliar, organics is a term that we're using to describe any sort of compostable material. So this is material such as food scraps or yard waste that can be broken down into essentially dirt. And the paper that I'm presenting on specifically was looking at what the Department of Sanitation is doing on the organics collection side. And this is separate from anything that commercial carters might be doing. So the title of the paper was, Can the Organics Collection Program Be Both Fiscally and Environmentally Sustainable? And the question we were really looking at was the environmental benefits of organics is pretty well known. By taking compostable material out of landfills and converting it into compost, you can greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there was a lot of questions surrounding the cost of the citywide organics program, and particularly the curbside collection program. So we wanted to know if there was a scale at which this program could be expanded, that we saw both the sort of large noticeable environmental benefits, but also it was scaled and became a fiscally something the city could sustain long-term. And I just want to sort of, the main takeaway of the paper that I hope if you leave with one thing today is that we can, as a city, according to IBO's models in this paper, we can scale up organics to a level where we do see these environmental benefits, and it is a cost that puts it roughly on par with what we currently pay for refuse or garbage. This would require getting the organics participation in terms of volume being thrown out into the organic stream significantly up from where we are currently at, and would also require seeing some economies of scale on both the collection and the processing side. So the ability to convert it into compost. And with that, I'm going to launch into some slides. So organics has a history in New York City almost as long as recycling. In the 1990s, this looked like yard waste collection on sort of a small scale. There's green market drop-off sites for organics, and there was a program in schools to have food scraps collected in cafeterias. But really, organics collection kicked off in 2013 with a curbside collection program. And this was the result of City Council passing Local Law 77, which mandated the city start a pilot program for curbside collection. And collection, it was originally rolled out in a few neighborhoods. This expanded year over year to additional neighborhoods until the expansion was halted in 2018. And at that point, it served about 3.5 million New Yorkers. But it was halted in 2018 because there were concerns about the cost. Organics looked expensive. And so neighborhoods continued to receive service, but they stopped adding additional neighborhoods. We see the program then came to a complete halt in 2020. And this was when the city in May of 2020 was looking to make budget cuts. The organics program got the axe. The program is now restarting. Curbside collection is restarting actually this week, which timed with our paper release. The drop-off sites returned this past April. So the city is sort of looking to get back into organics. And that was also a reason to sort of do a deep dive into the program. And we can see here, since the curbside collection began in 2013 through the point of cancellation, so the last year it ran in full was 2019, we see that the total tons being collected did increase. And in 2019, we were collecting around 48,000 tons. Now, this is a lot more than we were collecting in 2013. But to put this in context, this is about 1% of what is being thrown out in New York City, or in contrast to the 3 million tons of refuse that we threw out in 2019. One of the reasons that made organics sort of easy to pick on when the city was looking for budget cuts was that it had a high collection cost that made it look much more expensive than refuse or recycling. So we can see that refuse and recycling, the total cost hovers around $200 per ton. And in contrast, organics was hovering more than $700 per ton. Now, this total cost is made up of two components. We have the collection side, which is paying people to drive a truck and pick up what is put out curbside, and then processing. So for organics, processing means converting it into compost. For refuse, this means landfilling it. And for recycling, this means the process of either melting it down for metal and plastic or shredding paper to be repurposed. And IBO actually looked at the distribution of truck runs across recycling, refuse, and organics pickup and found that there was a large amount of volume for refuse and recycling, and that meant that truck runs could be designed to be relatively efficient in the sense that during an 8-hour shift, the truck was coming back to the tip site where it empties out the truck relatively full. And this was in contrast to organics, where an 8-hour shift, the truck was still relatively empty at the end of it, at the end of the run. And so this really, the cost difference between organics relative to refuse and recycling was largely driven by the collection cost. And the collection cost is largely driven by low tonnage available to spread out fixed costs over the number of tons being collected. So our first key finding was that increased tonnage makes truck runs more efficient, and this could help shrink the organics refuse cost differential. So we focused on, the paper focuses on the cost differential between organics and refuse. And the reason why we did that is because from a purely fiscal standpoint, there's a lot of thought on anything can be thrown out, but not everything can be composted. And so if it's cheaper to just send things to landfills, why don't we just send things to landfills? And so the real question was, can we see the environmental benefit, but also see a point where we have enough scale in the organics program that the cost difference is sort of shrunk or disappears? So I'm going to walk you through this graph and tell you how we're going to interpret it. But the main thing that IBO was looking to investigate was this relationship between annual tons collected and the collection efficiency. And here we're measuring efficiency in terms of tons per truck run. So how full are we able to fill up a truck over a shift? So as annual tons increase, truck runs become more efficient. This seems pretty logical. And here on the horizontal axis, we have annual tons. And on the y-axis, we have tons per truck run, our measure of efficiency. And each of these dots represents the annual tons being collected of either refuse, organics, or recycling at a district sanitation section level, which is a zone of sanitation. And we can see that organics in green here, we have very low annual tonnage and also very low efficiency. We're not collecting enough to fill up trucks. And so over the course of a shift, these trucks are coming back fairly empty. Recycling, we have more tonnage on an annual basis, and we see improvements of efficiency. And we can see as we move on annual tons, as we improve, there's a large gain in efficiency early on. So we see a large gain if we're able to shift along this curve early on with tonnage, and we continue to see gains in efficiency further out with annual tonnage, but the gains are smaller. And this is really the world that our refuse is at. This is the largest collection stream of the sanitation department. And the thought of the model that we built for this paper was that if we can switch what is being currently put into refuse appropriately, so if it's compostable material currently being sent to landfills, if we can switch that to organics, we would see an increase in the efficiency of our organic stream, and we would see a slight decrease in efficiency of refuse. And the question was, how much sort of tonnage can we switch into the organic stream to put these on a similar cost parity? And we think this is a reasonable thing for the city to be thinking about because almost half of what being thrown out is compostable material. So there is a lot of room to divert material from landfills to the compost stream. So at the current processing costs of organics, nearly perfect sorting of organics and recycling would be needed to bring organics cost on par with refuse. So we built this waste cost model building off of that log curve that I showed you previously. And IBEO looked at how shifts across the three streams, refuse, recycling, and organics, sort of changes the cost of these three on a per ton basis. And some assumptions to our model were that curbside organics program is offered citywide and that the amount of waste citywide would stay the same. So we aren't throwing out additional tonnage, but instead we are better diverting things away from landfills into either recycling streams or the organic stream. And in particular, we were looking to identify the diversion rates needed to bring organics costs on par with refuse. Again, I'm going to refer to this diversion rate. This is diverting the material we are able to divert from landfills over into other streams, recycling and organics. So this is going to be a lot of numbers, but I'm going to walk you through it and sort of highlight the takeaways that I'd like you to focus on. So at current processing costs, so if processing costs remain the same, high diversion rates would be required to bring organics costs on par with refuse. Now here on the horizontal axis, I have our recycling diversion rate. And this is sort of a menu of options that was meant to help readers of the paper sort of get a sense of different places the city could land. Currently, recycling diversion rate is around 17%. On the vertical axis, we have our organics diversion rate. And currently organics is around 1%. So we're not even at 5%. So our model was to show if recycling is at 15%, which is roughly where we're at now, but we got organics up to 5% diversion rate, the cost difference between organics and refuse would be $95. And we can see that this sort of works in that as we increase diversion rates for organics or for recycling, the cost goes down. And if we do increase diversion rates for both together, the cost goes down even faster. And we can see at a recycling diversion rate of around 30% and an organics diversion rate of about 35%, we actually are at cost parity with refuse. Now, this is a rather unrealistic place for the city to think we could get to because about 36%, 38% of what is in the waste stream is eligible to be recycled or composted. So it would require near perfect sorting across the city. And that's a heavy lift. But before we completely despair and write off the organics program, we also considered processing costs. Now, again, this is a lot of numbers, but I'm going to walk you through it. So reducing organics processing cost yields more scenarios where organics are at cost parity with refuse. This is the exact same table as the last slide, except now I've added some colors, and I'll tell you what the colors mean. So again, we have our recycling diversion rate, and we can see it increasing along the horizontal axis. We have our organics diversion rate increasing along the vertical axis. And again, the dollar amounts represent the cost per ton differential between organics and refuse at current processing costs. And as we saw in the last slide, we would have to be at roughly 35% diversion rates for both organics and recycling to bring organics costs in line with refuse. But as I mentioned, let's play around with processing costs. So if processing costs could be brought down to $100 per ton, all of the boxes in yellow, that dollar amount would be zeroed out. All of these options for diversion rates on recycling and organics would become cost effective vis-a-vis refuse. So let's say if recycling diversion rate is able to stay where it is, roughly 15%, and we could get organics up to 20%, and we saw processing costs down to $100 per ton, it would be competitive with refuse. Currently, organics processing costs are around $134 per ton. So where did this $100 per ton come from? This is roughly what the city is paying for its refuse processing. So if we can get the cost through economies of scale down to where refuse is, we have more options. We have to be less perfect on our organic sorting. And then if processing costs are able to be brought down to $80 per ton, and this is roughly what San Francisco is paying for they have a mandatory citywide organics program. And so this is sort of a citywide economies of scale level. We in fact could be cost effective. Organics could be cost effective compared to refuse at a recycling diversion rate of roughly where we're at now, and an organics diversion rate that matches. So essentially, if we can get everyone who's sorting the recycling to also sort the organics, and we see economies of scale the way other large cities with a municipal compost program have seen on the processing side, this could be cost comparable to refuse. And just to wrap up some conclusions from the paper. So we found that inefficient collection routes due to low tonnage was the main driver of high costs of the previous curbside collections program for organics. So the version of the program that got canceled in 2020. And increasing participation is not enough to control these costs. So just getting people to be better at sorting organics alone won't get us to a place where organics is cost effective compared to refuse. Processing costs must also be reduced. And ways that we can reduce processing costs, there is a sense that there is economies of scale. Currently, the city does not have composting capacity at a large scale, and so we're paying for it very piecemeal. There's also the sale of carbon credits. So by composting more, the city is offsetting greenhouse gases, and there's in fact a market for that. And also, lastly, compost is a material that can be sold, whether for agricultural purposes or gardening, in a way that what we send to landfills has no value. Expanding organics citywide would add truck runs, but the greenhouse gas savings from organics processing would greatly outweigh the emissions from these additional trucks. And this is really sort of a teaser for some of the environmental benefits of the organics program that we do cover more in depth in the paper. And then lastly, increasing organics participation would require a long-term commitment. And ultimately, the success of the organics program is dependent on public participation. So this would require a sort of citywide effort that probably would span multiple mayoral and city councils. And one of the things that we used in the paper to sort of think about how organics could go forward was looking at what the city did in terms of recycling. So we saw a long-term effort. Recycling was made mandatory, but then there was a big push to both enforce that and also increase public education to get recycling diversion rates up. And so looking at sort of the process and the timeline that it took to get recycling to a point where it's at the cost and collection rates that it's at now, gives us a sense of sort of the timeline that it would take to scale up an organics program as the city looks to consider what to do next with curbside organics. I am happy to answer any questions. I know that was a lot of information.
Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, I just had three quick things I just want to put in your mind as you think the rest of this through. One is the sanitation contracts with our labor unions are literally the worst and most inefficient contracts the city has. And many of the constraints that you're talking about here in terms of truck runs and so on are based on the current inefficiency of the sanitation contract, which actually would substantially change the dynamics you're talking about, one. Two, there are very different models of trucks that can take 1, 2, or 3 different kinds of waste. Given that the organic stream is relatively small, truck redesign may be an option to allow you to run the trucks and collect 3 different kinds of waste. as could be truck route redesign, meaning you collect some waste in a neighborhood on Monday and a different kind of waste on Tuesday. That is the trick that other cities have been using. I was spending some time in Milan this summer, which has a very strong organics program. This is a little piece about Milan's model I just put in the chat about how they do that, which is both mandatory, so it's part of what you're talking about, but it's also a little more efficient collection strategy. So the only point I want to make is that this is a fabulous analysis, so it's very, very interesting and sophisticated. But I just want to make sure you're not accepting constraints that maybe we don't have to accept, either in the technology of the trucks, the routing of the trucks, or in the labor union agreements that we have that limit our ability to collect waste efficiently.
So just go ahead. I can talk through some of the assumptions were that if someone is going out on a truck run, they can be assigned to collect a different material, but their routes, like the hours that they worked of that truck run, would not change, and that the existing fleet of DSNY is what we modeled it under, but with language in the paper around, first of all, the use of more dual bins or multi-stream collections. And also if they make their trucks more efficient, like they've moved to electric vehicles, which they just bought a few garbage trucks that are fully electric. There's also the environmental benefits there. So we're thinking with the truck runs, with organics, there's such low tonnage that there's really no way for any single run to actually come out looking particularly efficient. Whereas on the refuse and the recycling side, it's very clear that DSNY, the Department of Sanitation, reroutes and rethinks truck runs to be very efficient. And in fact, refuse, they're collecting just about a full truck on most shifts. It's rather impressive.
Yeah, what's not particularly impressive, Sarah, is if they finish their collection in 2 hours, they call it a day.
Yeah,
that's not a particularly effective way of collecting trash.
Well, it's better than organics right now. Yes. So I guess I will qualify it with that.
Sarah, can I ask a question before it even gets to the truck?
Yeah.
How are other cities good models on like what you do in multiple dwelling buildings, some of which have no staff, right? Like, so how do you operationalize it at the level of like very varied housing stock and some housing stock in the city, much that has no staffing? Like, how do you?
So if we think about this as the amount of what is being thrown out doesn't change, we're just sorting one piece of it out separately. So it's the same answer of where are these food scraps going right now in those buildings. They're going into trash cans. Ideally, an organics bin is even more, rodent and bug proof. So that in fact might help some vermin problems in the city if people actually do sort it out of their regular trash stream. But the volume doesn't change. So I think my short answer is wherever they're putting it now in terms of trash, you just allocate a specific bin or trash can for the separate stream.
Okay, I think we need to move on, although the discussion is getting more and more interesting. Thank you, Sarah. I should also say that we've been joined by James Katz, who's the new Deputy Borough President in Manhattan. So thank you for joining us.
For having me.
And Ronnie, do you want me to? I think we need to head into executive session.
Exactly.
Great. So we're going to be transported into breakout rooms where we can discuss advisory board candidates. So don't leave your Zoom. You're going to be moved into a breakout session. Do I need a motion to start the executive session?
Yes, you need a motion.
Okay, I need a motion.
Motion.
And seconded?
Second, whatever.
Great.
Okay, while you move into exec, we'll be pausing the recording. So recording pause.
So all we need is a motion to adjourn.
Great. Well, it's been good. It's been good seeing everyone. So I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Moved.
who's going to second that?
Second.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for the comments.
All right. Thank you. Great work.